All right, everyone. Well, I think we've gotten the latecomers in too, so we're going to get started here. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us here today. For those of you who are new, this webinar is part of the Aptible Update Webinar Series, which is a quarterly presentation that covers recent features and changes to the Enclave deployment platform and Gridiron security management products. So just to describe those a little bit more, our first product is Enclave. It's an AWS-based Docker container orchestration platform for deploying apps and databases into secure, isolated environments. And our second product is called Gridiron, and it's a security management tool to manage secure activities and generate compliance deliverables. Many of you are already familiar with these products, but what you're going to hear about today is some of the new improvements to both of these features from the lead architects of the two products themselves, Thomas Orozco and Skylar Anderson, respectively. So without further ado, the agenda for today's webinar is, first we're going to cover Enclave features and updates, followed by a Q&A for Enclave. And then we're going to go over some Gridiron features and updates with a Gridiron Q&A. Thomas Orozco is going to host the Enclave portion, and Skylar Anderson is going to host the Gridiron portion. Any questions that you have throughout, feel free to just post them in the Q&A in the Zoom controls. You can also use chat, but Q&A is a little bit better. We'll be monitoring that Q&A section throughout, and anything that we can answer live, we will. If there's too many questions, we will figure out a way to answer either via text in the Q&A response box or follow up afterwards. And afterwards, you'll be able to find the presentation video and slides on aptible.com/resources. So one important announcement that I want to make before handing this over to Thomas is a recent announcement for Aptible, the organization. In September, we officially became ISO 27001 certified. So ISO 27001 is an international cross-industry security framework that specifies requirements for managing security across an organization. So one of the ways that ISO 27001 differs from other frameworks, like say HITRUST or HIPAA, is that it is cross-industry. And one of the ways that it differs from other cross-industry frameworks like SOC 2 is that it is focused on the entire security processes for an organization, whereas SOC 2 is more closely focused on the technical safeguards that an organization implements. So what this means for you is that you can use Aptible's ISO 27001 certification to prove to your customers, your auditors, any regulators that Aptible, your hosting platform, has met strict standards for data security. If you have any questions about ISO 27001 or interested in pursuing ISO 27001 certification yourself, please just reach out to us at contact.aptible.com. We have a lot of familiarity going through the process at this point. We actually used our own product, Gridiron, to manage our certification process. So we're happy to help you with any certification questions you come up with along the way. And of course, you can read more about this on our website at go.aptible.com/ISO 27001. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Thomas Orozco to discuss some of the recent improvements in Enclave.
Thank you, Frank. All right, so let's jump in and look at what's new on Enclave this quarter. So for those that have already attended this webinar in the past, as you know, our goal with Enclave is to for it to be the best place for you to land your regulated or sensitive projects. And this quarter, there's two things we did to help with this. The first one is we're making Enclave easier to use. We invested a lot into making it more predictable and better documented. And we're also making Enclave easier to audit. We're really working towards it being really an audit-ready platform. So as long as you're deployed on Enclave, you can easily really pass audits, whether they're coming from customers or from regulators. So we'll start with ease of use. There's two sections really to look at here. There's a set of new features that I'd like to introduce, and then a set of improvements. So as far as new features are concerned, we have three. We launched a new documentation website. We now have self-service environment creation via the dashboard. And finally, the CLI has endpoint management, which is really about catching up on the dashboard. This was available in the dashboard for a while. We also have a number of improvements. The restoring backups now supports restoring across multiple environments. Maintenance pages are now served when your app is scaled to 0. They're served immediately. And finally, metrics now include CPU metrics. So we'll review all of these items one by one. And let's start with the new documentation side. So some of you may have already seen this. We introduced the new docs website earlier this quarter, actually fairly early this quarter. This landed in August. It differentiates from our existing, like what we had before. The main difference is that this includes a lot of reference material. So whereas before we had a number of really, tutorials and really a Q&A, FAQ format, this new website has really comprehensive materials. If you're really wondering and you want to dig deep into a particular topic, for example, if you're wondering how health checks work on Enclave, or like if you're wondering what are the various options for deployment, the new doc website really tries to be very comprehensive and really explains how these things work. Separate from it, of course, how you can use them. We've, of course, ported over all the material we had before, so all of the tutorials are still there. In fact, we've added new tutorials. We even have a sample application right now that you can deploy on Enclave. And we've also expanded our troubleshooting instructions. All of our troubleshooting documentation is more complete than it even was before. So this includes documentation for Enclave, but also for Gridiron. And if you'd like to check it out, you can just go to aptible.com/docs and just browse around or search for any topic that might interest you. And of course, we're very interested in your feedback on this. If you have any questions or feedback about the docs, feel free to reach out to us as usual. The next new big feature that landed this quarter, actually towards the end of this quarter, just a few days ago, is self-service environment creation. So this is the menu, the modal that you're seeing in the screenshot. You can access it via the dashboard. It's in the sidebar. You can just click on Create Environments and get this. And there's really two major changes here that will affect you positively. The first one is regarding Shared-Tenancy Environments. Before this change, you'd have to, if you wanted to, by default, you'd be deployed in US East 1, that is in Virginia. With this change, you can now choose the region where you would like to be deployed. So as of this change, you're now able to deploy to any region where we have shared tenancy stacks when creating a new shared tenancy environment. So that includes 2 regions in the US, US East and US West, as well as a region in Europe, and 2 regions in Southeastern Asia. These are little blue ones that you can see on the map. So for you, what that means is if you were already deployed in one of these other regions before, any new environment you create, you can now do that and just pick the region you want when creating it without having to go through support and ask for your development environment to be located somewhere else. And if you've never done that and you were always using the default, you now have the option of choosing another region. I imagine some of you may actually not even realize that these other regions were available before. So we're really happy for them to now be available directly when you create an environment. So that's for shared tenancy. For dedicated tenancy, the big difference is that it's fully self-service now. So most of you probably have dedicated tenancy environments on Enclave. These are also called, PHI ready, which is the wording we used before, like really referencing the tenancy. These environments, before this change, when you created them, you had to wait for them to activate. And this could take a little while. Typically, you could have a few hours to wait for the environment to activate, which was always could be a little frustrating, or would kind of get into your flow. You were launching a new environment, wanting to reorganize everything, and then you have to wait for us to activate it. So the good news is now that this no longer happens. New environments now auto-activate. So if you already have a dedicated tenancy environment, any new environment you create will activate automatically, so that you don't have to wait on us or anyone to go ahead and create new environments. So this is going to give you a lot more flexibility when you want to create new layers of logical isolation in your environments. And speaking of this, I think it's probably a good idea to recap a little bit about the various layers of isolation we have on Enclave. So there's really 2 of them, stacks and environments. So environments are first, let's start off with stacks first. So stacks, they're isolated really at the network level. So each individual stack on Enclave is a virtual network consisting of an AWS VPC and a set of Docker hosts, which are AWS EC2 instances. There's also a number of endpoints, which are ELBs and so on, as well as volumes as well. So that's stacks. And then you have environments, which is what you would normally create. Like you can't, as a user, you can't create new stacks. That's something we do. But as a user, you can create new environments. And environments provide logical isolation. So essentially, each environment actually is mapped to a given stack. So you have one environment, let's say, and they all like the stack that your environment is tied to determines where your app containers and database containers will be deployed. They'll be deployed on Docker hosts for that stack. And what's important to realize is that environments really provide logical isolation, permissions, and so on can be controlled on an environment basis, but actual network isolation really depends on the stack. If you have two environments on the same stack, their apps and databases can communicate together because they're on the same network. So in some cases, it's a feature. In other cases, of course, that's not desired, which is why we have two types of stacks. We have single-tenant and multi-tenant stacks. So single-tenant, or like dedicated tenancy stacks, are what you're supposed to use for sensitive and regulated data. And they're also that's why you have your PHI-ready environments and so on. And multi-tenant stacks, they're here just for like routine development where you're not handling any sensitive data. And so you have these two options when creating a new environment. You can pick which one's more appropriate for you. So moving on, the new feature I wanted to introduce in terms of ease of use is endpoints management. Prior to this change, endpoints management was in the dashboard only, so you had to go through the dashboard to create new endpoints, but it's now available in the CLI. So there's a set of new commands that you can see listed here that let you create new database and app endpoints. So they're all available, database endpoints, HTTPS endpoints, TCP, and TLS. You can create all of these via the CLI. So there's a number of use cases for this, but this was heavily requested, mostly for users that wanted to interact with their endpoints and deploy new apps, maybe stand up a Q&A app for HPR that they're opening without having to interact with the dashboard at all. So this is why this new feature became available, which essentially means you can now manage everything via the CLI, whereas endpoints were until recently something you had to go through the dashboard to manage. So of course, you might need to update your CLI to get access to this. So make sure you get the latest version, and you can of course navigate to the docs via the link on this slide. So go to aptible.com/endpoints if you want to learn a little more about how to actually what are the options you have, see some usage examples for the CLI as well. So that about wraps it up for the new features. And now I'll jump into feature improvements. So these are, of course, more minor changes, but still useful. The first one is restoring backups across environments. This was, again, fairly heavily requested. This means that whenever you use the backup restore command in the CLI, you can now use the -- environment flag to choose which environment to restore to. So this has a number of benefits. I'll get into that in just a minute. One thing I want to mention first, though, is this protects you against making mistakes. If you have a backup coming from a dedicated tenancy environment, we're not going to let you copy that over into a shared tenancy environment. We do your backups they can't leave the stack they were created in. Just again, to make sure that you don't accidentally copy data to somewhere you were not actually didn't mean to copy it to. So various use cases for this. There's mainly two use cases. The first one is if you have an analytics workflow, maybe you're restoring, your production data into a new analytics reporting database on a periodic basis. This lets you use different environments for this. So you can have your production environment where the actual live data is, and then your reporting environment, again, using logical isolation. Your reporting environment, different users will have access to, but the production environment, you can really lock down access to it. So this lets you essentially take a backup and move the backup to a less privileged environment. Likewise, if you have a development workflow where you use maybe you reuse existing data, you reuse production data for development after sanitizing it, this new change will let you do the same thing. You can really take your data and then port it over to a lesser privileged environment. Here again, all of this is documented as well. So if you just go to aptible.com/restore backup, you'll see a number of usage examples on this. The next improvement we've shipped is for maintenance pages. So maintenance pages, first off, let's take a step back and talk a little bit about what they are. So maintenance pages are what we serve on Enclave when your app is failing to respond to a request. There's, of course, a number of reasons why your app may fail to respond. One is maybe it just timed out. The other one, maybe just blew up in flight for some reason. There was a bug in your app and it just crashed. And we serve a maintenance page to the customer so that they can see something. And another example, of course, is when your app is not actually there. For example, if you're in maintenance and you've scaled your app down to 0. So prior to this change, what would happen when you scale to 0 is there would be a DNS level failover. Like you'd notice at the DNS level, like we have like a health check that happens there. That would notice, hey, the app is down. Let's route the traffic somewhere else to show on our page. With this, and the problem with this is that it might take a couple of minutes after you scale to 0 to show the maintenance page. So with this change, what we are doing now is we make that change ahead of time. So that ensures, and that's essentially what most users were expecting, which is why we made that change, just to make it behave just the way you expect it to work, really. So with this change, what will happen now is if you scale to 0, it will be a little slower because we have to do the DNS change first, but there will be no phase during which your customers will see anything but a maintenance page. So like your app will go down quietly and then the maintenance page will be served immediately. Of course, if you want to use this, you probably want to customize the maintenance page as well. So there's the maintenance page URL setting you can set on your app to tell us what page to serve for maintenance. The main use case for this, of course, is if you want to place your app into maintenance mode, maybe because you have database migrations that you'd like to run. You can use this change, just scale on to 0, and everything will happen smoothly as you expect it. And if you want to learn a little more about this, again, you can use this link. Go to aptible.com/maintenance page. Once again, this will take you to our new docs, and this will let you review what are the various settings that are available and really see in detail how this whole process works. And finally, to wrap up the improvements, the last one is metrics. We've included CPU in the metrics that we show. So that means that we currently have, before this change, we had memory load average, and for databases, we have disk usage. Now with this change, we now have CPU usage available for both. As you can see in this graph, we also show you your usage compared to your CPU limits. So you can use this to troubleshoot sluggish apps, get a better idea of how much CPU you're using, and they're available, of course, for apps and databases in both cases. The one thing you probably want to know about is what kind of CPU usage should you be expecting, what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. So at the platform level, what we do and what you should know is that we allocate 25% of a CPU thread per gig of RAM for your container. So that means that if you have a 1 gig container, you get 25% of a CPU thread. If you have a 2 gig container, you get 50%. And if you have an 8 gig container, well, 7, you get 1.75 CPU thread. The one thing you need to know, however, is that we don't necessarily enforce this everywhere. That really depends on the tenancy of your stack. So looking back at what I mentioned before, we have 2 types of stacks. We have shared and dedicated tenancy. And the difference really is on a shared stack, you're not the only customer. So if you're using up more than your CPU allocation, you're actually taking that away from another customer. So on shared stacks, we do enforce CPU limits, which means that your containers they'll be able to allowed to burst for a very short period of time above the limit, but that will be very short. Overall, you will not be allowed on a shared stack. You will not be allowed to exceed your CPU limit. However, on the dedicated stack, we don't actually enforce these limits. For the reason being that in most cases, that's desirable for the customer. And for us in practice, you're not taking CPU away from someone else. You're the only person on that stack anyway in the first place. So for dedicated stacks, CPU limits are fully opt-in. So it's really up to you to decide whether you want them to be enabled or not. We think it's better to enable them because performance is more predictable. But on the other hand, you have to keep in mind, of course, that if you enable CPU limits, you're likely to need bigger containers to have the CPU performance that you're currently receiving without the limits in place. So again, the decision is fully up to you to make. And the link that you have here, go to aptible.com/CPU limits, actually goes into this a little more in detail if you're contemplating that decision. Finally, last thing I wanted to mention really quickly, we've introduced also a couple of new databases this quarter. We've introduced support for Postgres 10. Just a few days after it was released. This one was widely anticipated. We had a number of requests before it even went live, so this is now available. And we also have support for Redis 4.0 as well. That about wraps it up for the changes we've made in terms of ease of use. Maybe if we have a few questions, we can take them now before moving on to the auditing changes we made.
We do. So the first question was about shared versus dedicated environments. Mark asked that his staging site is on a shared environment and has noticed that it is running slower than his dedicated environment. So this touches on what you were just describing. So that's question 1. And question So question one is why that's the case, and question two is there an additional charge to move to a dedicated environment?
That's a good question. So to the first one being, is there like well, first off, indeed, you should expect different performance on a shared environment because the CPU limits are active there, but not on your dedicated environment. There's no charge for additional environments. Really, like what we charge for is the underlying dedicated stack. If you have a dedicated stack, there is a flat fee for this. And you can actually have, if you want to, you can actually have multiple dedicated stacks as well. However, environments are free. That is, if you just go into the dashboard right now and you just click on Create New Environment, you can create a new environment on your dedicated tenancy stack right now. And you'll be able to deploy your development applications there if you'd like. The one caveat to keep in mind is that this means that your development and production apps will be on the same stack, which means they'll have network access to each other. So that might not be desirable. And in this case, you'd have to provision a separate stack, a separate dedicated stack on which to run your development applications. And this one, having a separate stack, that one would be something you have to pay extra for. I think, Frank, the pricing is $4.99 a month for stacks. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's $4.99 per month for each additional stack. If you're on a production plan on Enclave, you already have the one dedicated stack already.
Thanks. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, so another question is it possible to deploy to the app while it's scaled to 0, so while it's in maintenance mode?
Yes, you can just go ahead and deploy the app. It will essentially do exactly what you're expecting. It will just deploy the app, but it will not change the scale of the app. So this will actually happen very fast. When you deploy the app and it's scaled to 0, the only thing that will happen is that we'll make a cache of your Docker image. So this ensures that we host the Docker image in our own infrastructure. And the reason we do this is to make sure that, if later on your registry that you're using has problems and so on, then at least the image is stored with us. So when you deploy and you're scaled to 0, what will happen is we'll download the image and cache and store it in our own registry. And then when you scale back up, we'll use that image. But you can just proceed to deploy as many times as you want while you're scaled to 0. It's just, of course, not going to change, but you'll still be scaled to 0 after you deploy. You'll have to scale back to 1, 2, or more afterwards.
Cool. Thanks, Thomas. And then the last question for right now, this one's open-ended, but probably worth responding to the webinar. So we got a question, what kind of infrastructure are we using under the hood? Are we running on top of Kubernetes? What's Enclave built on?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question as well. We use our own scheduler. There's a number of reasons for this. An important reason why we've actually investigated moving over to Kubernetes at some point. One of the main reasons right now for us not to do this is because Enclave is more designed to operate, we have a number of small stacks. Kubernetes is really ideal for situations where you have a very large pool of servers and you can just throw your resources at them on any server. You don't really care too much about them. Whereas in our case, we actually have a larger number of smaller pools. Each of our customers has a dedicated stack that is much smaller. So it's very important for us to be very precise in the way we schedule containers to avoid various issues for you, like memory contention, CPU contention as well. So the short answer being we use our own scheduler and infrastructure. Kubernetes would not be entirely appropriate for us to use at this stage. It's something we're keeping an eye on. But right now, what I just mentioned, it wouldn't be terribly appropriate for us to use it right now.
Cool. Thanks, Thomas. That's it for right now.
We did. One thing I want to mention about this, we did actually speak a little more about how we are architected. I think it was 2 webinars ago. So not the one we did last time, which was probably in July. It was probably the one before. So if you look at our webinar archives, we actually talked a little bit about how our deployment processes work and so on. But first, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to support as well. We're happy to, if you have specific questions and any curiosity as well.
That's a great point, Thomas. I'll drop a link to that earlier webinar in the Q&A replies.
Thanks, Frank. All right, so that was it, right?
Yeah.
Great. All right, so moving on to our next section, which is making Enclave easier to audit. So there's 3 changes we shipped this month here. The SSH Session Logging, activity reports, and one which technically we did ship it, but it's still in private beta at this point. It's managed HIDS. So let's start off with the first one being SSH Session Logging. So SSH Session Logging pretty much does what you expect from it, considering the name. It lets you capture logs from SSH sessions. So in the screenshot you're seeing, I have Kibana open where I'm seeing my logs, and I'm actually logging into a session and running a Python, like a Django shell, and just touching users and everything. And all of this, I'm running this through Aptible SSH. All of this is being captured and routed to a log drain. So this feature really works just like other log drains. Right now, before this feature, you could capture app and database logs. And with this feature, you can now also capture SSH logs as well. So there's a number of use cases for this. The main one, of course, is like ensuring that access to your production data is fully audited, so that if someone logs in and makes a number of changes, you want to make sure that you know what changed. And maybe that's for an auditing requirement, and sometimes it's just to actually know what they did, because maybe there was a mistake that was made, or like you're unsure what was done, and you need to look back and figure out, hey, what did we do that day when we SSH'd in and touched a bunch of stuff. With SSH Session Logs, you'll be able to do that. So you'll be able to audit activity in these sessions and see what's happening. I should mention that this is typically a requirement if you're trying to conform with protocols such as high trust, auditing all access to production, and in particular, access to production through management consoles is typically a requirement. So if you're trying to pursue any of these, audit frameworks, we of course encourage you to set up SSH Session Logging so that you can actually you're all set, and that will make it much easier for you to mark that requirement as done. The next change that we're introducing, auditing-wise, is called activity reports. So activity reports are CSV downloads that essentially list all the activity in your environment, whether that's your activity or even automation from Enclave. For example, the backups that we do on a scheduled basis will be present in there. So in this particular screenshot, what I'm pointing at is like one deploy that I performed, but you can see like on this day, Thomas deployed this app using a particular Git ref. So these are like available in your dashboard, and they're generated on a weekly basis. You can find them under the activity tabs, activity reports tab in your dashboard. So again, they're posted here on a weekly basis, sometime in the morning on Mondays, and you can just go ahead and download them. Of course, you can also just get them in bulk later. Like we keep them. You don't have to download them every Monday. We keep them for you, of course. So this is going to be useful for you for a variety of reasons. Again, mostly useful in an auditing context, but this lets you review your team activity. You want to know how many times you deployed. You want to know where deploys came from, who's deploying the most. All of this will be available in activity reports. Maybe you'd like to look at suspicious activity, like someone is SSHing into production off hours when they're not on call. You can do that with activity reports much more easily than you could before. Finally, that's something that you can share with your auditors as well. If they want to make sure that you have an audit trail of all the changes that you're making to your infrastructure, these activity reports will help you do that. Once again, in our experience, this is something that comes up fairly often in various audit protocols. In particular, in ISO 27001, which we went through ourselves, auditing and making sure we have an audit trail of the deployments that we perform was indeed a requirement as well. And the last change that I want to talk about auditing-wise, of course, is manage HIDS. This one is a much bigger feature that we've worked a lot on this during this quarter. What it does essentially is that it audits the Docker host. So first off, what does it mean? HIDS is host level intrusion detection. Essentially making sure that at the host level, we're aware of if someone's trying to break in or even succeeding, making sure we detect that. So essentially, the goal of this is to audit the Docker hosts that your containers are running on, and generating reports on a weekly basis here again to show you, you and your auditors that this is to essentially prove the integrity and demonstrate the work that's being done to ensure the integrity of the various Docker hosts that you're deployed on. So you can use these reports to share them with your auditors or customers. If you have a customer that's doing a customer assessment, a vendor assessment, and asking you to prove that you have IDS running on your infrastructure. Or again, if you're going through high trust, again, this is a common requirement for high trust as well. If you're being asked to have IDS on your infrastructure, this feature can help you satisfy that requirement. And from a more practical basis, you can also use it to make to audit what we're doing as well, if you want to see what's going on and what's being done to secure your infrastructure. So with that, let me talk a little bit about how this feature actually works. So we have all our Docker hosts, and on all of them, so we have, of course, a number of containers, but we also have the OSSEC agent. So OSSEC is a an open source host intrusion detection system, probably one of the more common open source ones. So we have the agent running on these hosts and reporting to an OSX server. So essentially that reporting is really about just sending over a bunch of logs, periodically sending checksums of files as they change and everything. Really the role of the agent is to collect information and send it. The agent doesn't make any decisions as to like, is this a problem or not, which is a good thing. We want the agent to do a minimal amount of work so that it's more difficult, of course, to compromise. The OSX server then in turn will be like, its role is to look at these events and decide if they're worth alerting on. For example, if we're getting logs from syslog and some are fully informational, that's okay. But imagine someone's logging in, or like someone's running sudo, that's an event that's going to turn into an alert. So all the alerts that we get from OSX, they get aggregated and go through our review process. So we have 3 stages. The first one is an automated review process. This one really looks at the alert, and on the basis of that alert alone, decides, is this okay, or is this a security incident, like a potential security incident. So a particular case where it's okay would be like, some like scheduled task is running as expected. For example, we perform rootkit checks to scan for malware on a daily basis. That rootkit check running, that's not an alert. It's just good to know that it happened. And in the background, we're going to double check and make sure that these are happening on a scheduled basis as expected. But in practice, it happening is not worth further review. So that's going to get reviewed automatically. However, there are events that we can't review automatically. For example, like if someone's logging into an instance over SSH, it's impossible to say if that's legitimate or not just based on that piece of information. So in this case, what we do is that we go to our next layer of review, which is bulk review. In bulk review, what we do is we aggregate events from the rest of our infrastructure to try and get a better picture of whether that event is legitimate or not. So going back to my example of an SSH login, whenever someone logs into an instance on our infrastructure, we actually, if they're like an Aptible operator, we actually ping them in Slack and actually ask them to confirm, was this you? And if it is, then that creates, and if they confirm this, that creates an audit record. Now we can then correlate with the events coming in from OSX. So in this particular case, what we'd be doing is we're looking, hey, we have like Frank, for example, logged into this instance, but Frank also said it was him that logged into the instance. So we can, review that event. It's okay as is. However, like maybe Frank never said it was him. Maybe because it wasn't even him, right? So in this case, what we'll do is that we'll go to our next layer of review, which is manual review. This alerts our security team that there is an event worth investigating. And in this case, we actually have a human looking at it, which is like the ultimate authority in this case in terms of deciding whether this event is security relevant or not. If it is, then what we'll do, of course, is activate, like if it is like a potential intrusion that we're seeing, we'll activate our incident response process. Again, as we mentioned before, this one is going to be, this one was designed like in terms of the ISO 27001 framework as well. So in this case, we'll have like 3 stages where we assess the problem, contain it, and then eradicate it. And of course, potential customer notifications as well. If there were affected customers, and if applicable, then we'll reach out to them as well to notify them too. In either case, regardless of whether there was an incident to assess and evaluate, or if there wasn't, and it was just like an informational message that our team was discarding, all of this actually gets aggregated into a report, which is like a weekly report that we provide, which essentially serves as a piece of audit evidence for what we're doing. So this report is really just like, PDF download that you can get access to that essentially explains the whole process so that you can share it others with your auditors. And it includes, in this document, it includes, like a sheet that tells you, this instance, here's what happened on this instance during this reporting period and everything. So if this feature sounds interesting to you, and particularly if you're like currently using another IDS system deployed on Enclave, maybe using ThreatStack or AlertLogic, or if you have IDS needs, maybe a customer like a vendor assessment where you're being asked about IDS, or where you have a an auditor asking you about IDS. In any of these cases, feel free to reach out to us, for a demo or at least to talk about this via any channel. You can email support@aptible.com, or just open a ticket in Zendesk. If you're a premium support customer, you can also reach out to us in Slack as well. One thing I want to mention about this is we try to really make this fully managed. Really, you don't have to do anything. You just get the reports. We do everything else for you. So compared to other IDS systems, this should require much like much less effort from you. And we're also pricing it in a way that we think will most likely be less expensive as well. So speaking of pricing, the first thing I want to say is that, first off, OSSec it is deployed right now in all of our instances, regardless of whether anyone's paying for it. Like, we're not charging extra for security and host intrusion. Like, we're ensuring the security of our instances. That's our responsibility. And like, we're running OSSec for everyone anyway, free of charge. Well, I mean, included in your existing plan. However, access to the evidence, so all the audit reports, the PDF I showed before, there's also a CSV version. All of this, however, is a paid add-on. So right now we're planning for this to be 2 cents per hour per container gigabyte, only for production, well, for dedicated tenancy containers. So that would come out to about 25% extra on top of your existing container pricing. So if that sounds interesting to you, as I mentioned before, feel free to reach out to us via any of our existing support channels, and we're happy to show you a demo and talk a little bit about this feature with you. And with that about wraps it up for what's new in terms of compliance this quarter. And if we have any questions, we can take them now.
Yeah, we got a couple, Thomas. So one is on the most recent topic of managed HIDS. Dan asks if the OSSec server we run is multi-tenant, or if it's hosted within a customer-specific stack.
It's a good question. So the OSSec server that we're operating is multi-tenant. It's really just receiving events. We've disabled all of the, like OSSec has a number of features where it can send things from the server back to the agents. We've disabled all of these. So it's essentially like a write-only destination, as exists a few other in our infrastructure, for example, our log aggregation as well.
Cool. And the other question goes back to SSH Session Logging. And so we had a question about a log drain currently capturing only app and database logs. How would they go about adding SSH Session Logging? So
the easiest way to do this is just to go into your dashboard, create a new log drain, and only drain SSH sessions. You can use the same destination, of course. I'll use a different one. However, if you'd like, we can also enable this for you. So if you have a particular log drain that you don't want to add a second one, like you hate clutter and you don't want to have 2 log drains logging partial logs each of them, feel free to just reach out to support and we'll enable this for you on the existing log drain without you needing to provision an additional one.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Thomas. To the audience, if anyone has additional questions that they think of as the webinar continues, you can still ask them in the Q&A, and we'll get answers back to you one way or another. And without further ado, we'll hand it over to Skylar, who's going to tell us a bit about Gridiron and the recent improvements there.
Thanks, Frank and Thomas. Again, my name is Skylar Anderson. I'm the lead front-end engineer here at Gridiron, working primarily on Gridiron. And today I'm going to do a review over the past quarter and talk about some improvements and new features. As a quick overview, Gridiron, we like to think of it as the fastest and easiest way to manage your security management system. It's like how QuickBooks is to accounting. We are to information security management. New this quarter, we focus primarily on 4 key areas. The first is customer and vendor management. You can now add and remove customers and vendors and the agreements associated with them. We've improved your ability to be prepared for an audit with some new Gridiron reports I'm excited to share. We've improved your ability to manage assets and the components within your information security management system. And finally, we've made significant enhancements to the Gridiron risk model. Getting started with customer and vendor management, basically it's a single place where you can manage and track both the upstream and downstream contracts you have with your customers and vendors in a single Gridiron dashboard. Again, you can track all of your customers, all of your vendors, but in addition, you can track the agreements you have with each of those and the contingencies between those agreements. You can also upload and download the actual agreement documents. So if you have a service agreement or a statement of work or a BAA with your vendors and customers, you can upload them to this dashboard so you can quickly distribute to your team or everybody knows where to go to find those documents. Finally, we've integrated the vendor management portion with the existing asset management functionality in Gridiron. So as you're adding and removing systems and components to your information security management system, we're also pre-populating the vendors in your vendor management dashboard. So you're not left on your own to think of every vendor you're using. In fact, any existing Gridiron customer today will see a list of existing vendors that we've collected for them. So I'm going to quickly show a demo of these dashboards. Going to the Gridiron dashboard, under the Tools section, we see two new tools, Customer and Vendor Management. Customer Management starts with just an indexing of all of our customers I may have added, and I can quickly click into any one of these and see. So for example, I have a BAA, a Statement of Work, a Service Agreement. I can see that the Statement of Work is contingent on a service agreement and download any of these documents quickly. Vendor management works very similar. There's an indexing of all the vendors that I have a relationship with. These were pre-populated based off the systems and components I've already said I'm using. So if I click into Aptible, for example, I have some apps deployed on Enclave. I can see not just the agreements that I have with Aptible, but I can also see the systems I actually have and what's kind of defining my relationship with Aptible, what responsibility they have over these systems. So I know I'm logging to Elasticsearch on Enclave, and I have a database and apps hosted on Enclave. Moving on to audit preparedness, we are launching 4 new reports on Gridiron. These reports will go a long way to, number one, improving your own internal auditing capability. So for example, like if you're doing tabletop exercises for business continuity training, we have a report for that. If you just need to review your asset inventory and see where sensitive data is deployed, we have a report for that. These reports also work great for passing customer audits. We have an export feature for all of them that you can generate a CSV that you can email directly to a customer. All these reports were also inspired by our own ISO 27001 certification. These were reports that we had to generate as a part of our certification package. So we figured we would just build that tooling directly into Gridiron, allow us to use the tool ourselves to pass our own audit, and now we're circulating that feature back down to our customers. So these are the 4 reports we're going to show. The first is a training history report, which is just an export of your workforce and all the training modules that they've completed and the dates they completed them. Second is an asset inventory report, which is a comprehensive listing of all of the components making up your security management system. So these are things like the apps you have deployed, what networks they're deployed on, what are the hosting platforms hosting those apps, what data stores do they depend on, what sort of devices you're using. That's all included in a single report that you can export as a CSV. Third is a business continuity report. This basically allows you to execute your business continuity plan more quickly by showing you prioritized data related to all of your security management components, specifically for recovering more quickly from an incident. So you can see your apps and databases determine the priority of recovery based off, for example, the maximum tolerable downtime or the business criticality of each of those components. And finally, is the audit log report. This is a view into all of the components of your security management system, showing you quickly where they're logging to. So you're never having to guess or dig through some of the more nested screens in Gridiron. You can go to a single place to determine which components are logging where. So I'll quickly demo each of these reports and kind of walk you through them. The first is the asset inventory report. And again, this is just a high-level view of all of the components making up your security management system. I can see things like apps and databases and networks. I can see the hosts that I'm deployed to, the data stores and the logging destinations. I even can see the third-party services that I'm depending on and the level of data sensitivity for all of those services. There's many more attributes that we collect about all of these. So if you actually do the CSV export and open this up, there's a number of attributes you'll see. The second report is the business continuity report. And as I mentioned, this is useful for determining the priority of responding to incidents. So we're sorting these based off priority, basically, which is first the business criticality followed by the maximum tolerable downtime. And then for databases and data stores, we have some additional information about recovery time objective, recovery point objective, if backups are performed, if they're automatic or manual, where they back up to, if data is rotated in and out, or if it's persisted indefinitely. The third report is the audit logging report, and this is a simple breakdown of I have a number of components and I need to know where they're logging to. So I have a couple of apps and they're logging to like an elk stack on Enclave. versus like this image processor app is logging to Papertrail. And finally, the training records report is basically just an index of all of the training completions for all the users in our organization, along with which course and when it was completed. And again, I can download this and quickly view a CSV if I need to. The really important thing about these reports is that you will most definitely have to prepare them as a part of your certification package if you're going through like a SOC 2 or ISO 27001 audit. And we basically built these features to serve our own need, and we're very excited to share them with our customers. Third, we've made significant improvements to asset management on Gridiron. So asset management basically allows you to quickly and easily track all of your assets or components of making up your security management system. And again, assets or components are things like apps or databases, but then also services you may be using that those apps and databases depend on. So Enclave is a service. Different services within AWS like S3 or EC2, those are all services. We make it easy for you to track and know what sort of data is deployed on all those different types of systems and how they all depend on each other. We've expanded your ability to track components within your asset management system by adding things now like networks, devices, and third-party services. We've also added many new pre-seeded third-party systems and backends for you to choose from. So for existing Gridiron customers, you might have noticed that there's no easy way to just add your own system. Instead, you're always picking from a list. That's a library of systems that we maintain because it allows us to build our own risk profile and our own set of default data based off our experience and expertise and manage that information for you. So what that ends up doing is creating a very easy to use experience for a user because we're providing much of that default data about different systems for you. And I can show you what that looks like. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we've integrated our asset management capabilities with vendor management. So as you're adding services or configuring your apps to use services, we're determining the vendor and creating that for you in your vendor management dashboard. So I'll quickly demo what some of these new features look like. So going back to the Gridiron dashboard, if I scroll down under our security program, I can see I can configure multiple things like apps and databases and networks, backends, third-party web services, and devices. Devices is a new feature where basically you can tell us about the data and how you're hardening all the devices that your workforce depend on. So if your workforce is using laptops, or for example, if they might be using removable media, and for some reason, if they're storing like encrypted PHI and removable media, or if they're performing routine security reviews, like auditing laptops using MDM, you can configure all that here. Similarly, with third-party web services, this is showing like our indexing of available systems that you can configure on Gridiron. We've added the ability now for each of these systems to also have a relationship with existing components or existing apps. So if I switch over to the app screen and, for example, make a change to our patient portal app, I can now indicate that there are third-party services that this app depends on. This helps in business continuity and incident response planning, where you can actually see the dependencies between all of your components and know, for example, if Amazon Simple Web Service is down, which apps are affected. That basically concludes the additions to the asset management features of Dashboard. I'm next going to talk about enhancements we've made to the Gridiron risk model. The Gridiron risk model is a concept we covered in the January 2017 webinar series. And if you haven't seen that webinar and you're interested in Gridiron, I would encourage you to look at it. We covered kind of the abstract principles behind how Gridiron works and how we're able to analyze and quantify risk around an organization. And that basically allows us to perform like a deep risk analysis on your organization. But what's new this quarter is we've taken that idea of the Gridiron risk model and kind of pulled it apart and enabled it to be applied to any piece of your information security management system. So previously, the scope of the risk model was just was generic enough to apply to just your organization. we've now updated it to be applicable to all parts of your security management system, starting first with apps and the various app types. So examples of that would be if you have a web app versus a single page application. Those have two very distinct risk profiles. And we have built those default risk profiles and are attaching them to all the assets in your asset inventory, and then exposing some UI to allow you to configure that risk profile on top, so you can ultimately quantify risk specific to each component in your asset inventory. So again, to review, we're pulling the Gridiron risk model out of just the organization and making it applicable to all things, so things like apps and databases, devices, and networks. We're expanding it further even to physical locations or vendors and hosting providers, but also the third-party web services. And this is all, some of this is in progress, some of this is complete. I'm going to show you the portions that are complete with a quick demo. So going back into Gridiron, if I click onto the Security Controls tab, this is new for any existing Gridiron user, but previously we only covered these organizational control categories. But what's new here is we now have a new set of control categories specific to the app instances I've created. And again, each of these profiles is unique to the app type. So a single page application has a much smaller surface area for risk than like a web app. You know, the web app has the largest profile because it has both a front end that delivers HTML, but then a dynamic back end that's like processing user input or uploads or providing authentication. So this patient portal app is a web app, and I can click and view the assessment here. The parts of the risk model that we expose are just the predisposing conditions and the security controls. The predisposing conditions are facts about you that expose you to risk. The security controls are the things you're doing to mitigate them. And we now expose some of the details of our model in this UI. So I can see if this database, or excuse me, if this app connects to a database, I'm exposing a number of threats relevant just to this app. Clicking the security controls, I can see the opposite. I can see the things I can do to harden this app and what for each of these controls could I potentially be mitigating. We make it easy to sort these by priority. So if you were like implementing a security plan of action, you could look at all of your apps and understand what features are missing and which might be of higher priority because they mitigate the most risk. That concludes my demo of new features for Gridiron. I'm open to any questions or comments.
Thanks, Skylar. Yeah, we did have one question about contract management. And the question is about what types of, or what are some examples of agreements that should be tracked in Gridiron versus agreements that would not be tracked in Gridiron? And are there limits to what one should be using contract and customer management for?
That's a great question. I don't think there are limits, but there are some things you definitely want to keep in there. So this was a feature also born out of our own ISO 27001 audit process, where one of the documents you'll need to include in your certification package is an index of all of your legal and regulatory requirements. So this is basically all the agreements or contracts that you're obligated to adhere to. You'll need to provide documentation and an audit trail of those agreements. So we're building the tooling to build that report for you, and that's a coming feature of that report. So any sort of contract that you may have, either with a vendor or a customer that you are obliged to follow should be uploaded. The most common will probably be the BAA, particularly with vendors, and if you're using AWS or Aptible. And we do plan to expand this feature to automatically upload some of that documentation as a part of our, automating the vendor management process with the existing assets we know about. There are no limits. So if you have an agreement that you'd like to track, you're welcome to track it. It will be included in the legal and agreements report that I mentioned once we launch that feature, though. Cool.
Thanks, Skylar. Dan asked another question. I can grab this one. Dan asked, I understand that Gridiron aided Aptible to achieve ISO 27001, but does the product itself meet some ISMS standard, and are there such standards? So yes, and this is actually, like if you look at the ISO 27001 certification, that's, if you just go to aptible.com/resources, we have the certificate up there. Part of ISO 27001 is defining the scope of the audit, And in this particular case, the scope is the information systems and networks, personnel, policies, and operational procedures used in the direct provision of Aptible, Enclave, and Gridiron. So it does cover both products. And in particular, because ISO 27001 is more broadly focused on organizational processes than some other security frameworks, this covers everything, not only just the technical safeguards that are implemented, but all of our organizational procedures for securing both Enclave and Gridiron. So this is a great question, and the answer is yeah. Gridiron is under the scope of our ISO 27001 certification. And there's one more question that Damon just asked. So Damon asks, in Gridiron and Enclave, is it all customer input to populate? Or are there areas where a customer can track action items such as attacks? And so I think to the latter question, Skylar, maybe you can talk about the incident response tool in Gridiron.
Yeah, I think he's getting at two things I'll touch on. There generally speaking, as a part of the Gridiron risk model, we do track attacks, and it's how we're able to quantify risk and prioritize the controls that you should implement. So those are controlled by Aptible. We don't allow you to add specific threats. However, if you experience a threat and you need to respond to it, then as Frank said, we have the incident response tool that lets you manage that workflow of you detected something happened and you need to organize your team around how you're going to respond to that particular attack. So those are two different, I'm not sure which Damon is referring to, but those are two different capabilities within Aptible. In general, the risk model is configured by Aptible with some features of the model exposed to the user. And we're experimenting with adding more customization. But general things like attacks and vulnerabilities, we maintain that mapping of how those relate to actual components in your security management system.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Skylar. And Damon, if you had any further questions about that, feel free to just follow up, and we can answer directly if we didn't get the correct answer to the question that you were trying to ask there. So that's it for this October 2017 Aptible Update Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be January 25th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, if you want to mark your calendars. We're going to post links to the video and slides on our blog and on aptible.com/resources. And we'll also send a follow-up email to all attendees with those links and a link to register for the next webinar. So until then, thanks so much for joining us. Hope this was useful, and see you next time. Thanks.